We're picking up on this occasional series of sermons called What Is? And in this series we explore what is meant by religious-sounding phrases and words that are commonly bandied about or are found in the scriptures that aren't really used by anyone else apart from Christians, really. And today we're asking, what is justification? Or more particularly, what is justification by faith? Because throughout the history of the Christian church, when people have come back to this and grasped it afresh, renewal has broken out within the church. The Protestant Reformation was all around realizing the meaning of justification by faith. So belt yourself in and focus. To be justified means to be declared righteous. The Greek word for justified is the same as righteousness. It's actually being made right with God. What makes you right with God? What justifies you before God? But what does that actually mean practically? One of the classical explanations of justification by faith goes something like this. Imagine a courtroom in which God is the judge. We stand before the great judge, knowing that we've all fallen short of God's glory. We come before the glory of God, we know we're not really fit to be there. Knowing that the penalty for not being fit, for not being righteous, is to be separated from God, is of concern. Because God is the one who gives life. The life giver. God is the one who sustains our life. So to be separated from God, that's quite serious. But as we come before God the judge in this courtroom, instead of condemning us and withdrawing from us forever, God offers a surprising verdict upon us. God judges us to be free, to come closer, not to be chucked out. God judges us free to enjoy forever the divine source of life and love, if we say yes to that. That's the heart of the Christian doctrine of justification by faith. God is merciful and gracious to us and declares us righteous, not because of what we've done, though, but because of what Christ, God in Christ, has done for us. As many passages of the New Testament put it, God has come to us in the person of Jesus Christ. Christ has lived the perfect human life that we could not live. And then has paid the penalty for our sin, for our separation from God, on the cross, in Christ's death. Our judge, in effect, became a human being and paid the penalty that we could not pay. And Christ's resurrection is like the seal of new life in Christ. Like I say, if we accept that, if we want that. You with me so far? Sort of. So how do we receive this justification? Paul is clear. It's by faith. Faith is the key that unlocks the door of God's grace for us. It's us saying, yes, I'll have that. I'll put my trust in that. So at the heart of the Christian faith lies this central belief that we are justified, we're made right with God, not by our works, not by our moral effort, not by our religious observance. We're justified by faith in Jesus Christ alone. As the reformer Martin Luther put it, faith is the hands that receive the gift God is giving us. God doesn't force it on us. He says, here, do you want it? Take it. It's yours if you want it. So that classical understanding of justification by faith is the one you see echoes of it throughout the New Testament, particularly in Paul's letters. But it can sometimes, when described as I've just described it, make this doctrine seem a bit like it's purely theoretical, or it's just a decision we make in our mind and doesn't change anything in our lives. But in Galatians 2:11-21, which Shirley read for us, the Apostle Paul argues that justification by faith has huge implications for the way we live, and especially the way in which we live alongside others, not least those who are different from us. Paul begins with the story of a confrontation that he himself had with another great leader in the early church, possibly the greatest, the Apostle Peter. He calls him Cephas, but he's meaning Simon Peter, the friend of Jesus, the one who Jesus said, "You are the rock, and on this rock I will build my church." That's who he's having an argument with. The confrontation hinges upon a certain understanding of the Jewish purity laws that said that Jewish people should not eat or socialize closely with Gentiles, which is the name by which they referred to those who weren't Jews. And while Paul and Peter and Jesus himself, they were all Jewish, Jesus had told Paul and Peter and the other apostles to share their faith in him with the Gentiles. The great commandment at the end of Matthew's gospel, he says, "Go, make disciples of all nations," all people groups, every ethnicity, whoever they are. Share me with them. Make disciples. And in the process of sharing their faith with all kinds of different Gentile people, Paul and Peter had, each in their own way, and if you want to know how it happened with Peter, read Acts 10 and 11. At length it talks about what happened to Peter that suddenly opened his eyes to see, as Paul had already found, that in the mercy and grace and undeserved favor of God, those who accept all of that, those particularly who know and see the grace of God in Christ, are at liberty to break the purity laws to the extent that it prevents them from mixing, being hospitable to, accepting hospitality, eating, socializing with those who are not Jews. There was a group, and it was mentioned in there, sometimes called Judaizers, sometimes called the circumcision group, who were saying, well, look, really this Christian faith is an extension of the Jewish faith, and therefore if a Gentile man becomes a Christian, then he needs to be circumcised which you can imagine put a bit of a barrier between Gentile men and faith in Jesus Christ. And Paul and Peter had said, no, that's not necessary. Significantly, Paul and Peter are having their confrontation in a place called Antioch. In Antioch, the church consisted almost entirely of Gentiles who had become Christians. And there, Peter and Paul had been eating and socializing with the Gentiles. But one day, Peter suddenly stopped. Why did he stop? He stopped because some certain men arrived from the Apostle James in Jerusalem, where there was not much mixing going on with Gentiles. And these certain men were of the circumcision group. And Peter got nervous and he feared their judgment. And so he withdrew from mixing with the Gentiles. And now here's the problem. By doing this, Peter wasn't just hurting the feelings of the Gentiles. He wasn't just making a social mistake. His actions were sending a message. By pulling away, Peter was essentially saying, faith in Jesus isn't enough. Justification by faith, it's not enough. To really be acceptable to God, you need that, and you need to follow these rules. Paul was livid. If you read Greek and you read Galatians, there is no doubt about it. He is livid. The standard way of writing a letter in Greek was to begin by giving thanks to God for the people you're writing to. You read Galatians, there's none of that. He is so annoyed that people in Galatia are believing that justification by faith is not enough. He can't let it slide. In fact, he's so outraged, he says in verse 14, when I saw that they were not acting in line with the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas, in front of them all, you're a Jew, yet you live like a Gentile? How is it then that you force Gentiles now to follow Jewish customs? What Peter was doing and what this so-called circumcision group from Jerusalem promoted undermined the Christian gospel. Oh, it's not by grace after all. You still with me? It's difficult to tell. The good news of Jesus is that God's grace is enough. It's all you need. Anything we start adding to that, human rules, rituals, traditions, anytime we start adding to what God in Christ has done for us and saying these other things are necessary, we're stepping out of line with the gospel itself. Paul does not stop with calling out Peter's behavior. He digs deeper. He gets to the heart of the issue in verses 15 and 16. He gives us one of the clearest explanations of justification by faith, a bit like the classic one I gave you with that, the judge and the courtroom. As one who had once held rigidly to the Jewish purity laws himself, Paul says this to those who still do. We know that a person is not justified by the works of the law, but by faith in Jesus Christ. So we too have put our faith in Christ Jesus. that we may be justified by faith in Christ and not by the works of the law. Because by the works of the law, no one is justified. Paul is saying that our right relationship with God does not require us to strive to prove ourselves, because we can't. To work to earn God's favor through our own efforts, because we'll always fall short. To keep on to a very particular and restrictive set of rules. Because to do that is just hemming yourself in and very often making yourself miserable. It doesn't require us to be constantly comparing and judging ourselves against others. Because this isn't a competition. Once we understand that justification is by faith and not by works of the law, we're free to let go of these religious burdens. Faith in God's mercy and love and grace seen in the life and death and resurrection of Christ, that's enough. That's all you need to be right with God. And Paul then doesn't just leave it there. He goes on to show us what this faith looks like in practice, in action. First, Paul tackles a common objection. He says in verse 17, if in seeking to be justified in Christ, we Jews find ourselves also among the sinners, doesn't that mean that Christ promotes sin? Absolutely not. In other words, some people were saying, well, if I, as a Jew who's kept all these rules, start mixing with these sinful Gentiles, surely that means me, I'm sinful too. But for someone who's religious to start saying that they're better and less imperfect than someone who isn't, that's not the reality. Paul is saying that those of us who are truly justified by faith and not by law do not suddenly become worse as a result of that. We don't go rogue and wild. Instead, faith in Christ changes us. We have a new identity. We don't suddenly become less good just because we believe it's not our goodness that saves us. Paul explains the transformation in our identity in verses 19 and 20. He says this, for through the law I died to the law, so that I might live for God. I have been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. The life I now live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. Paul is saying that those who are truly justified by faith are not bound by religious laws anymore, but will be living a new life. Our old selves are gone, but Christ now can live in us, can help to change and transform us. We'll be speaking about this a bit more in 2 weeks' time when we look at a different word. And now everything we do by faith in Christ. And Paul grounds this transformation in God's love for us. He says, the Son of God, who we live for when we put our faith in what he's done for us. The Son of God loved me and gave himself for me. That's the motivation. That's the power behind the life of faith, as 1 John 4 puts it. Because God first loved us, we can we can love others. Finally, Paul ends in verse 21 with a strong warning. He says, I do not set aside the grace of God. For if righteousness could be gained through the law, if it could be, if that wasn't enough, and if I could actually make myself right with God through these rules, then Christ died for nothing. If any of this was of any value, then what's the point of that? Paul's saying that if I could earn my way to God, if there was some other means of being made right with God, then the cross of Jesus Christ, God coming to become a human, to live, die, and rise again for us, well, that's pointless. We don't need that because we could have used this other route. Why has God gone to that trouble? Because there's no other route. We can't earn or obey our way to bridging the gap that we've created between us and God. So the God who loves and longs to bridge the gap has come and done it for us in Jesus Christ. There's a fabulous passage in John's Gospel that's often read at funeral services, but it's talking about the eve of Jesus' death upon the cross, when he's gathered with his friends, with the apostles, including Peter. They are full of fear. And Jesus comforts them with these words. Do not let your hearts be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me, he said. I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Peace I leave with you. My peace I give to you. I do not give to you as the world gives. Do not let your hearts be troubled, and do not be afraid. When we embrace justification by faith, when we get what it means, even if we forget what the phrase is, when we get this, it changes everything. It frees us from guilt and striving. It frees us to be filled with gratitude. It compels us to live for the one who has given everything for us. So what is justification by faith? And I promise I won't be testing you later. It is this: you are made right with God, not by your works, not by trusting in what you can do, but by trusting in what God has done for you. It's all about grace, the grace and love, the self-giving of God that we see in the sacrifice of Christ. So if you find yourself still carrying the weight of striving, trying to earn your way into the good books, if you sometimes sort of stay away from church or going up for communion because you think, I'm not worthy, you're not. That's the whole point of the bread and the wine and it's because we're not. We're saved by faith. We come and say, I need this because I can't do it by myself. If you've been relying on yourself, let go of it. Put your trust in the God who loves you. Trust in Christ who lived, died, and rose for you. Rest in that grace, that undeserved favor that is there and being offered to you. Take it by faith. And if you've already done that, may this truth continue to shape your life, that you may walk unchained and free, grateful to the one who's given you life in all its fullness.